France did not see what is happening in West Africa coming. So they find themselves at a time when they are very weak economically, when at home the population of immigrants is growing bigger and bigger. You go to cities such as Marseille, you find Algerians, you find Moroccans, you find Senegalese, you find Guineans, you find Burkinabe, and things.
The world woke up stunned as Africa delivered a shock Europe never imagined possible. Overnight, the continent, long underestimated, long lectured, long exploited, made a move so strategic and so forceful that it sent France and the entire EU scrambling into emergency meetings. Ports across Europe slowed, factories dimmed, markets trembled. Suddenly, Africa was no longer the junior partner it was, the economic engine the West could no longer control.
Hi guys, everyone is watching US or China, but the real financial bomb is here in Europe. France is one of the largest, biggest economies in the world and is now buried in debt it can never pay. Over 100% of GDP, rising fast to 120%, the point of no return. The government spends more on interest payments than on education. The debt doesn't serve the state anymore. The debt manages.
For decades, Europe treated Africa like a resource vault with no expiration date, but that era just ended. Africa rose with new alliances, new manufacturing power, and new control over the very minerals and goods that Europe's fragile economy depends on. And when Africa finally exposed how deeply the EU relied on those resources, the shockwaves tore through Paris, Berlin, Brussels, and the fallout has only begun. The question that now rattles Europe's halls of power is simple, terrifying, and unavoidable. What happens when the continent you thought you could control becomes the one that controls your future?
The news for Europe just keeps getting worse.
The French government collapses, plunging EU's second largest economy into turmoil.
France's political upheaval in December offered another glimpse at fractious European affairs.
Germany's under pressure and Volkswagen workers are striking hard.
In my view, we are already in a crisis mood.
Our former model is over. If we follow our classical agenda, we will be out of the market. I have no doubt.
This is what I warned them about in '98.
You're saying that France is probably one of the weakest countries of Germany, UK, Spain, and France. You're saying that France is probably the weakest financially, and that'd be your number one pick to default on debt?
Yeah, look, it's the second largest economy in Europe, too. We're not talking about Greece here. That was 2010. You know, the rumor is, I don't know if it's true or not, but rumor is that they've been dipping in.
The warning signs had been flickering across Europe for years, but it was Africa that finally forced the lights to go out. For decades, France believed it could manage, influence, or steer the continent's economic future while insulating its own structural weaknesses behind polished speeches and diplomatic posturing. But when Africa truly shifted, France's fragile economic foundations were exposed before the entire world. And now the shockwaves were racing across the EU faster than any summit or emergency policy document could contain. It began quietly through a wave of coordinated decisions that even analysts in Brussels struggled to understand at first. Countries across Africa had grown tired of the old economic arrangements that had drained their resources while offering little more than political pressure and limited industrial development. A new alignment emerged, built on strategic self-reliance, intra-African trade strength, and a network of high-stakes partnerships extending across Asia, the Middle East, and South America. The continent that many in Europe had underestimated suddenly became a powerhouse of rare minerals, clean energy supply chains, manufacturing zones, agricultural exports, and digital innovation. France was the first to feel the shift. What had once been preferential access to African markets collapsed almost overnight as African nations renegotiated or terminated long-standing resource agreements. The New Deal's African countries signed no longer favored old colonial structures, but instead prioritized local refining, local manufacturing, and local employment. For the first time in modern history, Africa dictated the terms and global markets listened. The consequences in France were immediate and severe. Industries dependent on African resources struggled as supply contracts were rewritten or halted. Energy companies scrambled as African nations rerouted oil, gas, and critical minerals to partners offering better financing, better technology transfers, and genuine respect for sovereignty. Investors fled French sectors that had long relied on predictable African inflows. Price shocks rippled through manufacturing lines, transport networks, and energy markets. Suddenly, France's economic stability looked like an illusion maintained by outdated assumptions. The French government tried to downplay the crisis at first, describing it as a temporary restructuring or a manageable shift in global dynamics. But inside the EU, panic spread. The continent had relied heavily on African supply chains, even if it rarely admitted it. Africa was the silent backbone of European manufacturing, from electric car batteries to agricultural imports, from construction materials to pharmaceuticals. Losing direct or easy access to these supply chains was not just an inconvenience, it was a threat to Europe's economic security. In African capitals, leaders were calm, almost serene. They had anticipated the pushback and prepared for it. Industrial zones that once exported raw minerals now exported finished components. African tech hubs, strengthened by international partnerships that bypassed Europe, launched cloud infrastructures, fintech systems, and logistics networks that challenged long-standing European firms. Agricultural modernization programs allowed African nations to export premium crops to Asia and the Middle East at competitive rates that undercut European suppliers. Africa was no longer reacting to global shifts, it was driving them, and France was the first nation to experience the fallout, but it would not be the last. The EU's internal markets struggled to adapt. Germany questioned the reliability of France as an economic anchor. Italy warned that Europe's energy transition depended heavily on African cooperation, which France had just jeopardized. Eastern European countries demanded immediate negotiations with African blocs to salvage their supply chains. The EU Commission issued late-night statements promising stability, diversification, and renewed partnership, but it only highlighted how unprepared Europe truly was. Meanwhile, African nations continued unveiling bold initiatives. A unified mineral pricing mechanism shocked European commodity traders who had grown accustomed to setting benchmarks themselves. A joint African investment fund, capitalized with billions from non-European partners, announced incentives for local manufacturing hubs designed to replace European imports within a decade. The continent that had once been treated primarily as a resource pit was transforming into a global economic pole, and France's miscalculations had accelerated the shift. The political consequences in France were chaotic. Businesses protested. Workers flooded the streets demanding answers. Analysts warned that the country's economic model had been exposed as dangerously overdependent on external extraction rather than internal innovation. Opposition groups blamed decades of short-sighted policies. The government scrambled to negotiate with African blocs, but the conversations were different now. The tone had changed. Africa no longer approached France as a partner seeking approval, it approached as an equal demanding respect. Inside Africa, the mood was electric. From Dakar to Nairobi, from Lagos to Addis Ababa, from Cairo to Johannesburg, the message was clear. The era of economic extraction was over. The continent was now shaping its own industrial destiny, and the world would have to adjust or fall behind. African youth, long frustrated by unemployment and underdevelopment, now saw new opportunities opening in manufacturing, digital industries, renewable energy, and high-value exports. For the first time in generations, the narrative was shifting from dependency to dominance. France watched helplessly as its influence evaporated. The currency arrangements it once used to control African monetary policy were being restructured or abandoned. Its defense agreements were being reviewed. Its energy companies diversified too late. Its grip on African markets collapsed, leaving a void that new global players eagerly filled, and with France weakened, the EU felt the tremors. Investors questioned the long-term stability of the bloc. Eurozone forecasts were downgraded. Trade negotiations with African blocs became diplomatic minefields. Even the EU's identity as a global power was questioned as African leaders publicly criticized Europe's outdated strategies and failure to adapt to a multipolar world. But beneath the headlines and diplomatic tension, something deeper was shifting, a global recognition that Africa, long underestimated, had risen to claim its place in the economic order, not as a supplier, not as a dependent, and not as an extension of any foreign power's interests, but as an independent force reshaping trade, technology, and geopolitics. France had failed to see it coming. The EU was now scrambling to react. But Africa, confident, united, and strategically aligned, was only just beginning its ascent. Europe's capitals awoke to a new kind of fear, not of war, not of invasion, but of economic obsolescence. Governments that once believed their industries safe realized overnight their foundations were crumbling. Trade ministers in Brussels scrambled to draft contingency plans. Bankers in Frankfurt and Milan ran numbers late into the night, trying to calculate how much of Europe's economy hinged on African supply chains, and in Paris, the realization hit hardest. The days of relying on Africa as a resource reservoir and support network were over. In Berlin, factories that built electric vehicles halted production lines. Parts once imported from North Africa or West Africa became unavailable. Orders vanished. Suppliers folded. Engineers were laid off. Within days, whole plants stood silent. The German auto industry, long heralded as Europe's backbone, faced the harsh reality of disrupted supply and fractured agreements. Italy's food and agriculture sector suffered too. Europe had long expected African produce, citrus, coffee, spices, grains to keep its markets flowing. But African exporters, freed by new continental policies and new trade partnerships with Asia and the Middle East, refused to accept old European pricing or middlemen. Prices soared on European shelves. Grocery stores rationed imports. Consumers began to complain. Supermarket chains scrambled to source elsewhere but found limited alternatives. For once, European dependence on African agriculture was painfully visible. Spain and Portugal, historically tied to Africa through trade and geography, watched helplessly. Their shipping ports, once busy with African goods, grew quiet. Fishing agreements dissolved, investment deals stalled. Their economies, already fragile after long financial strains, dipped further. Youth unemployment jumped. Migration pressure between Africa and southern Europe intensified, this time driven by reversed flows. African investors and skilled workers chose to stay in booming continental zones rather than risk unstable European markets. Meanwhile, Africa's markets thrummed with energy. New export invoices flowed not to Europe, but to Asia, the Middle East, and South America. Ports along the Atlantic and Indian Ocean coastlines operated round the clock. Freight corridors connecting landlocked African countries to coastal refineries expanded, roads and rail links under. Construction for decades were finally completed. Factories that once processed straw or was loaded now churned out finished components, batteries, electronics, machinery parts ready for global delivery. African financial markets surged. Stock exchanges in Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, and Casablanca recorded historic highs. International investors poured billions into infrastructure bonds. Renewable energy projects, previously stalled for lack of funding, received capital faster than they could organize construction teams. A Pan-African digital currency, long rumored, surged in value as markets responded to growing intracontinental trade and decreased reliance on foreign currencies. The economic forecast for many nations on the continent changed from fragile optimism to aggressive growth. This rising tide exposed yet another vulnerability inside the EU, reliance not just on African imports, but on African labor markets and migration flows. European tech companies, manufacturing plants, shipping firms, many had long employed African workers, engineers, miners, laborers, container port staff. With the economic boom in Africa, many of those workers returned home voluntarily. Europe's labor shortages began to worsen, construction projects delayed, hospitals, restaurants, logistics, every sector that relied on migrant labor started seeing cracks. Union leaders demanded action, governments scrambled to set up emergency hiring programs, but there was no ready workforce to replace the exodus in response. EU policymakers convened across capitals. Emergency summits were called in Brussels, Berlin, Madrid. Proposals ranged from renegotiating trade deals with Africa to establishing new mining initiatives inside Europe. But all plans carried heavy risk. Raising tariffs might provoke further African retaliation, and mining inside European borders would take years to ramp up, by which time Africa's influence would only grow. Public confidence shifted dramatically. European citizens watched stock prices tumble, petrol and energy costs surged as raw materials became scarce, basic goods became more expensive, social unrest simmered, demonstrations erupted in several major cities. For many, the crisis felt existential, a sense that the world they had counted on was collapsing. In this climate, Africa stood firm, its strategy unwavering. African trade ministers announced transparency benchmarks, environmental standards, and fair labor practices to show that their rise wasn't built on exploitation but on sustainable development. They made a point of contrasting their model with Europe's decades of extraction. Underpayment and pollution, Africa's narrative was no longer one of poverty or aid, it was one of value, agency, and global influence. In North America and Asia, companies scrambled to align with the new African supply networks. Tech firms that had once outsourced manufacturing to European subcontractors began negotiating direct contracts with African factories. Automotive groups considered shifting final assembly plants to African ports, close to mineral sources and low-cost energy grids. Renewable energy companies saw Africa as the ideal ground for solar. And wind projects scaled at continental level. The global balance of industrial gravity was shifting away from the traditional Western axis and toward a rising Africa. The shock for Europe was personal. People realized that decades of economic privilege, cheap imports, resource security, stable labor supply were illusions. The continent had relied on a world arrangement built around colonial-era supply chains. Africa's refusal to carry that burden anymore didn't feel like hostility, it felt like reality. Europe had to rebuild or fall. In Paris, cultural industries crumbled as budgets shrank and international partnerships froze. In Lisbon, small businesses shuttered as cost of goods rose and consumer purchasing power fell. In Athens, tourism suffered under economic instability and shrinking investment. Even Scandinavian countries, often considered insulated, were hit. Their manufacturing exports slowed due to raw material shortages, and tech industries found it harder to secure critical components. Across Europe, the need for a new strategy became undeniable. Some governments proposed aggressive investment in domestic mining and recycling. Others argued for deeper economic integration with Asian and American markets, but these solutions required time Europe no longer had if Africa continued accelerating. Meanwhile, Africa's youth celebrated. Where once the only escape was emigration, now opportunity blossomed at home. Universities expanded engineering programs. Training academies prepared generations for jobs in manufacturing, energy, programming, logistics. Entrepreneurs launched startups in sustainable agriculture, tech manufacturing, digital services, and renewable infrastructure. Former expatriates returned home, bringing skills and savings to invest locally. The idea of brain drain reversed. Africa was welcoming brain return. Global media began calling the shift the African awakening, a phrase that resonated far beyond the continent. Commentators in New York, Tokyo, Dubai, Sao Paulo discussed how supply chains, power balances, and economic leadership had quietly migrated south of the Mediterranean and deep into the tropics. Africa was no longer a fringe market. Africa was the center of the next industrial revolution. Back in Brussels, EU leaders met in closed sessions. Documents titled Economic Vulnerability Report swept through ministries. Charts showed rising deficits, shrinking import volumes, loss of investor confidence, and growing unemployment. Leaders debated fiscal stimulus, redistribution of manufacturing, and emergency resource sourcing. Plans, but none offered immediate relief. Within the corridors of global power, one truth became undeniable: Africa had redefined the game. What had once been considered a peripheral continent was now an essential pivot point for global supply, energy, manufacturing, and growth. Europe had watched, Europe had ignored, now Europe was paying, and for Africa, the rise was real. The world was no longer looking at a continent of promise, but at a continent of power.